Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the first monthly Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL Project Update webinar. First, we are going to introduce the project team for today's presentation. My name is Melinda Harris, and I am the supervisor of the TMDL program in Ohio EPA's Division of Surface Water.
I'm Josh Griffin. I'm a Lake Erie program manager in the Central Office Division of Surface Water.
This is Paul Gledhill. I'm the technical staff with the Division of Surface Water.
Hello, this is Heidi Griesmer. I'm the Deputy Director of Communications for Ohio EPA.
And good afternoon. This is Kirk Hines. I'm the Chief of the Division of Soil and Water with the Ohio Department of Agriculture.
Hi, I'm Eric Sauce. I'm the ODNR H2 Ohio Program Manager.
Hi, this is Kelly Dubay with Tetra Tech. I'm also joined by Corey Edwards of Tetra Tech. If you have any difficulties with this event, you can reach out to Corey at the email address provided in your confirmation, and I'm going to help moderate today's chat. I'm going to provide a quick overview of how today's webinar chat will work. Anytime during the presentation, feel free to type your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will go ahead and have folks scan through those. You won't see your questions appear to the public, but everybody that you just met on the project team will be able to look them over and see all the questions that are submitted. The state agency staff that make up the project team will take some time toward the end of the presentation to answer some of participants' questions. Please note that we won't be able to get to all the questions asked today, most likely, one, due to time, and two, possibly due to the fact that some of the questions you may ask may not actually be addressed through the current point of the TMDL process. Do know, however, that the questions that aren't addressed today, some of them may make their way into the Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL Frequently Asked Questions document that you'll hear about in a moment. And that document will be updated regularly. And I believe Paul will talk a little bit more about that. So that's how the chat will work today. So feel free to just go ahead and put those into the chat box as things come up, and we'll make sure that we take a look at them. So back to Melinda.
Today's webinar will review the Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL project timeline and where we are currently in the project development. We will also summarize revisions we are making to the draft loading analysis plan, preview the next step in the process, which is the preliminary modeling results, and highlight what stakeholders should look for next as we proceed with this project. First, I want to mention that Ohio EPA has a new website. The website went live on December 3rd. All the old information is there. We just have new navigation and new links to pages and documents. Here on this slide are the new links to the TMDL program name page and the page where the Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL tab is located. So we hope you have some fun exploring around our new site. And if you have any problems finding documents that you need, please feel free to email the EPA TMDL account. I also want to give a quick reminder that there are 3 outreach modules available on Ohio EPA's YouTube channel that provide background on this project. In general, Ohio follows 5 major steps in the development of a TMDL project. For the Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL project, we are currently finalizing Step 3, the loading analysis plan, and starting Step 4, the preliminary modeling results. This slide depicts our current project status that I just mentioned. The timeline has major project milestones and outreach opportunities noted. This is one of the items that was requested during our November listening sessions. We will continue to revise this timeline as necessary and include it in future project updates. I am now going to turn the presentation over to Paul Gledhill.
Good afternoon. I'm going to start with some review of material that folks that have been following along are probably familiar with, and then we have some new material. So first we'll start with noting that we are in development of those frequently asked questions document that Kelly mentioned. We've received a great deal of comments from those modules Belinda just outlined, and from publishing the draft loading analysis plan. It is our hope that a frequently asked questions document will be a helpful resource that can contribute or that can continue to be updated throughout this project and into the TMDL's implementation stage. Here's an example of a frequently asked question. We know that plenty of folks have not totally understood the geography of this project. So getting the Lake Erie's harmful algal blooms in check, that's what the TMDL is all about. And the blooms are fed by excessive nutrients being delivered to the lake primarily from the Maumee River watershed. Now, there are 3 Lake Erie assessment units that have impairments that are directly related to this TMDL. On this map here, we see these. So let me get my pointer up. The dark green area, that's the Western Basin shoreline. The light green is the Western Basin open waters. And then the little purple areas, that's the shorelines around the island. This TMDL will allocate or provide guidelines for limitation for nutrients from Ohio's portion of the Maumee watershed. That's the big gray area on this map. So the TMDL will provide a plan for nutrient reductions from the Maumee watershed to address impairments in the lake being driven by those nutrients. Now here's the TMDL process with the steps listed out again. The loading analysis plan draft report, it has been published and the comment period has closed. We are currently working on responses to those comments and changes that will be made in this document. And on the next few slides, I'm going to outline some of those changes. Ohio's loading analysis plans for TMDLs basically do 3 things. They first document what the impairment the TMDL will be addressing. Next, the plan outlines the pollutant targets that we will be using to fix that impairment. And finally, it outlines the modeling methods that the TMDL will employ. There will be revisions to all 3 aspects of this in the loading analysis plan. I'm going to go through those one each on the next 3 slides. So a few slides ago, I explained the geography of this project, how nutrients delivered to the Maumee watershed will be used to address impairments that we call our Lake Area assessment, in what we call our Lake Area assessment units. The loading analysis plan will be updated to more clearly explain these points. There will also include more detail on how we will address nutrient loads delivered from the Maumee River from Michigan and Indiana. So no substantive changes here. We're just going to spell this out better. The final loading analysis plan will also include much more information about dissolved reactive phosphorus, or DRP. The draft plan said that we are only providing reduction allocations for total phosphorus, but we will focus on recommending implementation or reduction efforts that best address DRP. Now, we received comments from stakeholders about this, and therefore we've reached out to a group of experts in the field to help us guide us on how to better address DRP. We have written a lengthy appendix that focuses on DRP that's going to be included in the LAP update. This explains that the increases of this particular parameter have largely brought about the modern cyanobacteria HABs in Western Lake Erie. This appendix explains the importance of DRP's needed reductions to address Lake Erie's HABs, and it also explains the challenges of uncertainty with accounting for DRP movement and modeling. New material in the LAP highlights Ohio's commitment to DRP reductions. Now, while there are many uncertainties in accounting for DRP, we do have world-class monitoring data throughout the Maumee watershed. The final LAP will explain how DRP will be included within the total phosphorus TMDL allocations. And this report will review some of the analysis we plan to include on DRP in our next step of the TMDL process, the PMR, which I'll explain in a minute. Taken as a whole, these changes will go much further in guiding reduction recommendations to focus on DRP throughout the watershed. Now, Melinda and I went over this slide in the webinar that we held in October. The updated loading analysis plan will include much more information about the model selection process used for this TMDL. It will explain that by using a mass balance method for TMDL allocations, we're providing flexibility in implementing nutrient reductions. More sophisticated models, such as SWOT, will be utilized in this TMDL to explain the sources of nutrients. For instance, this will allow us to better understand the amount of phosphorus coming from legacy soil sources and from manure. This important step, combined with the new focus on DRP, will help us identify the best implementation actions to address HAB impairments in Lake Erie. So we've mentioned a few times last month, Ohio EPA held a series of listening sessions about this TMDL project. And now these meetings were broken down into 3 groups, and the groups are shown on the top of this slide. There were certainly some similar themes to the feedback we got receiving the loading analysis plan. All groups wanted to see a more focus on dissolved reactive phosphorus. Also, more detail on modeling methods were requested. And this included wanting to see modeling methods that show more detailed source assessments, the manure, the legacy, and et cetera. So as noted on the last 2 slides, updates to the loading analysis plan will include more material and more detail on these subjects. Well, throughout the TMDL process so far, we have received a steady stream of comments about the issues highlighted on this slide. Now, these questions and issues are certainly important to meeting nutrient and ultimately Lake Erie HAB reduction goals. However, this is material that's generally considered in the next step of the TMDL process, the preliminary modeling results step. And during our November series of listening sessions, there was a great deal of discussion about these factors. Stakeholders generally expressed a want for the TMDL to outline detailed sources of nutrients. Manure and legacy phosphorus sources were key among these. Participants also wanted assurances that phosphorus sourced from all locations will be considered. For example, we heard about stream bank erosion and resuspension of deposited material in the waterways. There was also discussion on the equability of required reductions. Will the reductions be required by sources at the same rate that they are currently delivered? That was asked a lot. And in general, everyone is interested in how the TMDL allocations or the needed phosphorus reductions will be required or recommended. Ohio EPA intends to work with stakeholders in addressing these issues as we move forward with the development of this next stage of the TMDL. So we're now at the time where we can start having these discussions. On the next few slides, I'll outline some of the aspects that must go into the next step, the preliminary modeling results report, but then we can kind of get back to these items. So this slide highlights the components that are required, that must be included in an Ohio TMDL's preliminary modeling results report. If you think of the allowable TMDL load as the amount of phosphorus that fills up this bucket, well, the acronyms on the bucket are how that load must be divvied up. So we'll explain these acronyms on these next couple slides. The first is the load allocation. This is the allowable loads from non-point sources. Note that loads from agriculture areas and non-permitted stormwater, so from developed areas, they're all combined in this category. It is our intent to keep these sources combined in the actual TMDL allocations. The TMDL will still include detailed source assessments of where the existing non-point sources are coming from. So it will spell out the differences, for instance, from legacy soil sources, from inorganic fertilizers, manure fertilizers, suburban and urban stormwater. Explaining those detailed source assessments will give us the information that we need for detailed source reductions. However, dividing those detailed sources out by actual TMDL allocations is not a required component of a TMDL. And clearly explaining the sources, but not rigidly limiting detailed sources with allocations, we believe that will give us the most flexibility in implementing reduction activities. And this flexibility is needed because understanding phosphorus delivery from sources and movement through the watershed continues to evolve. It's in very constant study right now. So the next acronym in that bucket was the waste load allocation. And that's the portion of allowable load that is assigned to point sources. This includes industrial and public wastewater treatment plants. Regulated stormwater, such as MS4s and categorical industries, are also included in this category. The Clean Water Act requires that permitting actions or limitations be made that are in accordance with whatever waste load allocations are assigned in a TMDL. TMDLs also reserve load for margin of safety and an allowance for future growth. Factors such as the uncertainty in pollutant delivery and modeling are normally considered when determining the margin of safety. This is load that is not assigned to any source and is to remain unassigned. Reserving load for future growth most often considers the future permitted loads that may be required to discharge to meet population and/or industrial expansion. Okay, so back to these bubbles that we had earlier. These are the issues that we're receiving the most regular feedback. And most of these items come into play regarding the reduction implementation actions that the TMDL recommends. So here we've kind of narrowed it down to the point sources, the issues around point sources. A work group discussing point source reduction has been suggested, and we are currently identifying participants for this group. We expect the meetings to start in early January. As you can see from these bubbles, there's a lot of issues to consider. So right now we're going to take a pause and real quickly mention sanitary sewer overflows. There's been a lot in the news lately about sanitary sewer overflows, and we want to have a few slides on this. Sanitary sewer overflows are prohibited. They will not receive an allocation in this TMDL. The plan to address any and all SSOs, sanitary sewer overflows, is elimination. Communities that operate their own wastewater plant and collection systems that have known SSOs, they are working to eliminate them, either through their permit schedule or they're under orders. Now, regularly reported SSO are regularly reported to us via folks' NPDES permits. But note that they are still a prohibitive discharge. What's gotten the most media attention has been the City of Maumee's SSOs. And we got two slides here to kind of explain what's going on there. Ohio EPA staff was notified last year in 2020 that the City of Maumee had unreported SSOs. Now, just like any other community with an SSO, these are prohibited. The City of Maumee does not actually own its own wastewater treatment plant. Their flow goes to Lucas County. So they don't hold a traditional NPDES permit that would normally govern that they have to report these events. However, they do have an MS4, a stormwater permit, and it was a violation of their MS4 permit to not report these SSOs. In July of this year, the City of Maumee entered into orders with the state. They paid a penalty, and they have agreed to take immediate actions to mitigate these SSOs. Data collection is undergoing. Flow meters are being installed to monitor how much flow is coming out of these SSOs. The city has been required to develop a plan for elimination. Now, as far as the SSOs from the City of Maumee that we've learned about, it's estimated that that source is less than 0.02% of the average annual load from the Maumee. That's a rough calculation, and as we get these flow meters installed, we'll have a better idea of the actual numbers. But as you can see, it's a very small amount. So here, we've limited the bubbles of stakeholders' concerns to non-point source issues. Again, there's quite a bit to look at. We anticipate a work group to discuss non-point source reduction implementation actions that can be recommended via this TMDL. This group will work closely with the Ohio Department of Agriculture and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, as they are the primary implementers of these actions. So an important instrument in facilitating non-point source reductions are 9-element plans. They're also known as non-point source implementation plans. These are developed at the small subwatershed or HUC 12 scale, and they're developed in coordination with local stakeholders. The plans propose actual projects that can be carried out to meet pollutant reduction goals. Now, currently, we have many existing 9-element plans in the Maumee watershed. This TMDL will spur development of new plans, and it will provide recommendations for new load reductions in existing plans. Finally, during the November listening sessions, we asked for feedback on this project's outreach plan. We learned that providing regular updates with plenty of notice is important. Having hybrid formatted meetings that allow folks the option to attend in person or to remotely join is also needed. Providing as much material ahead of time for the in-person meetings will help participants be more prepared at these outreach meetings. Daytime and evening meetings were also outlined as being needed. We heard feedback that future outreach meetings should be open to all stakeholders, not divided out by interests. However, interest-focused technical groups were supported by the folks in the listening sessions, and as I just mentioned, we are working on developing some of those. So based largely on feedback, this slide shows the next steps of this project. We plan to have a monthly outreach, either via a webinar like today or in-person meetings. The next outreach will occur on January 20th. Mark your calendars. There will be a morning meeting at the Ohio Northern University in Ada and an evening meeting at Bowling Green State University. A remote virtual option will be available for both meetings. On February 15th, we'll hold our next project update webinar like we're holding today. Also on this slide, I want to point out that we do have the goal to publish the draft preliminary modeling results report by the end of March in 2022. That concludes our prepared statements, and now we'll probably take a pause and Kelly will guide us through some questions.
We actually don't have any yet, but that's not to say folks don't have some they'd like to share. So if you do have questions now, feel free to put them into the Q&A box available on your screen. And as they come in, I will make sure that our team sees them and they will be able to answer questions that are timely and they have answers for at the moment. So we'll just take a minute and let people think of their questions.
So Kelly, were you going to read in the questions to answer?
I'm happy to do that, or if you want to take it, Josh, it's up to you.
Okay, I can just read it in. So we got a question. Please share with us how you will be developing the controllable load and load reductions. What mechanism will you be using to define the growth of loading? How will the challenge and lack of spatial and temporal data be addressed within the specification of the loads within the segments of the basin? How will you be able to adequately define the hydrology within the multitude of segments and sub-allocations? So I think, my reaction to those comments is that the TMDLs specifically being developed at, the outlet of the watershed. So the load allocation and waste load allocation are specified at that watershed outlet. I think that's one of the things that helps support the mass balance approach. We're using that model, so it is directly linked to the data we're collecting on the Maumee River at the Waterville gauge. There's an estimate of the load downstream of that point based on the composition of the watershed, but it's constrained by the watershed and environmental response upstream and the monitoring data. So with that, we are, understanding the loads from the different parts of the watershed further upstream is very important for implementing the TMDL. So we've used the mass balance approach to look at, identifying loading targets for individual HUC 12s, but because they're not part of the specific TMDL allocations, we do have some flexibility with how we determine what loads are coming from where and how exactly they're addressed. And that is generally going to be accomplished through smaller local watershed planning. So it's a complicated question, but a lot of the reason why we selected what we are doing is that the scale that the TMDL is being computed at versus the scale that we envision implementation occurring.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, we'll take another one from the team in just a moment. Okay, here's a question that Josh, you can go ahead and answer. How will permanent discharging home sewage treatments be addressed in the WLA?
So, the mass balance in the past has accounted for household sewage treatment systems as a component of the loading. It was not broke out into what we would look at as a waste load allocation versus a load allocation. We had more flexibility in that context. We weren't constrained by the TMDL, so all of the HSTS loads were grouped together. But within that, there is a component of the load that was calculated for discharging HSTS. There's a subcomponent of those discharging HSTS that are currently permitted with Ohio EPA, but as those fail and are replaced, and we work forward in improving household sewage treatment system discharges, we will be permitting more and more of them if they can't be remedied by tying into a POTW or being replaced with an on-lot discharge. So we have the data in the mass balance calculations to include the discharging HSTS as part of the waste load allocation. We haven't made any management decisions that would suggest any specific reductions are targeted at those discharges.
Okay, Josh, we have a question about work groups. And I'll get to that. Hold on real quick. There's a question about work groups. So are the work groups that are under consideration work groups for point source and non-point sources?
At this point, I think we've broadly considered the work groups in that context, but we haven't really set up our first meeting yet. I think we're more prepared to start at Ohio EPA talking about the point source implementation and the types of management and also the management decisions we have to make for point sources in the meantime. So we're looking to next month to start setting up early next month. We're going to be reaching out to some folks to gauge their availability in the first couple of weeks of January. So we're looking to get that specific work group kicked off very soon, but I don't know that we've pinned down exactly what kinds of work groups are appropriate on the non-point source implementation side, whether that's one broader focused work group of individuals, a focus group of individuals that's a little bit broader, or if it's several groups of individuals that are focused on more specific points to discuss, whether certain groups are as interested in implementing manure management types of issues versus commercial fertilizer. There's a diverse group of stakeholders that might be more interested in some parts of non-point source implementation than others. So we haven't really pinned that down yet, but we will be working with ODA and ODNR in the near future to start refining what we think those groups need to look like, hopefully for some initial discussions, maybe more towards the middle to latter part of January.
Thanks, Josh. And actually, and the next question kind of jumps off your comment about working with ODA and ODNR. So can you provide more detail on how Ohio EPA is working on the TMDL with ODA and ODNR? For example, is most of the collaboration happening at the director level, or are the staff level employees working together? For example, ODA staff working with Ohio EPA staff directly?
So I think that's kind of, I think we're working together on kind of all levels. Our directors do meet regularly. The Ohio Lake Erie Commission helps coordinate some of that. We've collaborated extensively on previous implementation strategies, including our domestic action plan. So we're really working with those relationships, I'd say both at the staff level and, at higher levels of our agency to ensure that people are engaged from the different agencies and that we're working together towards one goal and improving water quality. So.
All right, thanks, Josh. Okay, let's see. There was a question about CAFO. So hold on real quick. I'm going to scroll.
Kelly, this is Kirk. I think I can try to answer the question on CAFOs if you'd like.
Perfect. And do you want to read it out to the group?
I sure will. So
Thank you.
I think the question is really saying, you know, if the MOMI is being monitored closely, and as I understand it, it talks about when there are violators, why are we not, or can we not monitor these CAFOs near the sites for the violations? So, you know, if I understand the question, I think it's a great question about, you know, when we do have a violator, are we doing follow-up inspections and monitoring those sites? So in terms of monitoring, I think probably part of the question is regarding, you know, stream monitoring and looking, you know, further downstream for that situation. And let me just back up and say, you know, for the CAFOs that are inspected through the Department of Agriculture, if they were to have a discharge, then, you know, they would be required to eliminate that source or that discharge. So if we see an overflow or if we see a pipe being discharged, we would obviously require them to fix that issue. So, you know, and then as far as though if there was something happening from a land application, we would be inspecting those facilities twice a year at a minimum, and then be following up on their nutrient management plan, and also then looking at those sites. So I think this monitoring is occurring, and really we would just want to eliminate where the discharge or where the concern was, and then obviously looking downstream may be applicable, but as long as we're eliminating that, we wouldn't necessarily have to look further downstream. So hopefully I answered that. So sure appreciate the question.
Thanks, Kirk. All right, I have a next one. I think Josh or Paul, you guys can field this one. Are we saying, or are you saying that sources will be lumped together? For example, manure, chemical, fertilizer, et cetera, in each HUC, and then we'll have overall reductions for each of those sources in each watershed?
I'll do my best to answer because it's a difficult question. So there's the TMDL itself is a calculation that has the four components that Paul identified in the preliminary modeling results. There's the load allocation, which is what we would traditionally think of as the non-point sources. The waste load allocation we would typically think of as point sources, and we have some additional requirements for a TMDL where we reserve load for a margin of safety and an allowance for future growth. So when we calculate the TMDL, all of the things that make up the load allocation will be lumped together. And there are some reasons why we have to do that. And part of it is we don't have a complete understanding of exactly what loads from what part of the landscape are what is getting, you know, to Lake Erie. So the exact by putting allocations on specific components that make up that load allocation, we are really overreaching the modeling capacity that we have, whether that be the mass balance model, which is traditionally thought of as a more simple approach, or a more detailed simulation-based type of a SWAP model. There's always limitations where you make your best estimate as to what one part of the landscape is relative to the other, but feeding those inputs into those models requires a lot of generalization. So it's an important exercise and a valuable one to do it. And we can learn a lot about the relative impact of different sources, but to try to test or model with the specificity needed to say X% or X pounds of phosphorus is allocated to this source in this HUC 12 really goes beyond the capacity of any of the models that we could potentially have at our disposal to do so. So rather than trying to have a high level of specificity, we're going to rely on a robust source assessment. So using both the SWOT models that we do have, the large data set we have from edge of field monitoring, other modeling efforts, and any other way we can evaluate the data we do know about the watershed to guide our implementation plans to focus on areas that we think the most important loads are coming from, or the different source categories. So that's the way that we would be moving forward with the load allocation component of the TMDL. And then at the local level, with like the development of a 9-element plan, or even at a smaller level than that, where a soil and water district is working with an individual operator of a farming operation, and you really can hone in on the really specific details of that farm and how it's being managed and how it's being operated. That's when you can start to get the level of refinement, so you can know where actual loading sources are on that farm. Are there hot spots on that farm? Are they using manure? Are they using commercial fertilizer? Are there areas where they have a lot of erosion, or not? How is water moving across the site? So there's really a lot of local factors that need to be considered when being really specific about implementation actions, or even relative source contributions, that make it challenging to do with that level of specificity in the TMDL. But that doesn't mean that it's not an important part of deciding how to move forward once the TMDL is calculated with implementation. And of the most value is being able to move from the watershed scale to the local level and have the types of discussions needed to really understand what's going on the landscape without the broad generalizations we have to make when we're doing watershed level estimation.
Thanks, Josh. Are you ready for the next one?
Sure.
Okay. So the question is, how will the TMDL support point source, non-point source trading? How will modeling make this possible and affect point source to non-point source trading?
So my general understanding of trading is that there is one of the reasons why we don't see it happen as often as one might expect, because it looks like a really valuable tool, is that there's not a regulatory driver of trading, meaning that point sources aren't required to have, if a point source isn't required to have reductions, and that those reductions don't line up with things that are reasonable to trade for to the non-point source community, that there's not a fundamental driving force for someone to put the effort into developing a trading program. And there's a cost point for that for wastewater treatment plants, where it's more effective and more cost effective for them to treat their phosphorus further in their POTW effluent versus develop a trading program. So where the TMDL may facilitate that is any reductions, or if, for example, there were a POTW that wanted to grow, but they weren't able to secure the load that they needed to do so through the allowance for future growth, it could serve as that kind of facilitator for trading and the development of a program where you now have a need for phosphorus reductions. And that's really one of the missing components for trading historically in Ohio, and why we haven't seen widespread adoption. So the TMDL could result in facilitation of trading programs in that way.
Great. We have another one. Let's see, give me 1 second. One moment. Okay, the next one, Josh. How can Ohio EPA justify using the BMPs listed in its draft TMDLs when dozens of studies show those practices are minimally effective at best and more often actually increase DRP runoff? Let's see, the commenter has links to support this, but the software won't allow them to be entered.
So I would add that, most of our TMDLs have been developed in the past with, a very specific focus toward total phosphorus. We didn't have the same dissolved reactive phosphorus link. So we were really developing implementation plans and recommendations that were likely different than what we're going to be talking about now. And I think that's also a landscape where we're continuously learning about what practices do work better than others. I'm sure some of the studies, the being suggested in the question are also speaking to that information that we continue to learn. So we'll continue to work with ODA, and I think Kirk might have some things to add about how we might identify practices that would work.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I just certainly did want to share that, I think it's, again, a good question and really talking about whether it be, cover crops or manure incorporation. And I think we're certainly aware that, many of these practices, depending on the time of year and so many things, they could be a source or a bit of a sink for DRP, and it depends so much on the nutrient source, the timing of the application of the BMP or the conservation practice, the rates that are applied, and the hydrology. So I think these are all things that we continue to look at, and just sort of wanted to share with the group here. Right now, what we're really looking for those practices that are directionally correct is what we've talked about, and really worked with some consultants and others, and looked at some research to pick those. But I think, as Josh said, we'll continue to refine those and adapt over time. One of the biggest things we're doing is looking at, real edge of field data for practices and seeing what those results are. And I think even Paul talked about this early on, some of the challenges with DRP, but, we'll continue to refine that. And I think, you'll see some changes in practices as we go along with H2 Ohio. We've identified, what we think are the best practices right now, but those will continue to evolve over time.
Kirk, while I have you here, I have a follow-up question from one of your previous answers. Are all land application sites associated with CAFOs monitored twice a year, or just the violators?
Yeah, so really what we do is most CAFOs are certainly inspected, what we call inspections, twice a year. And certainly we're evaluating those nutrient management plans. So it's, it's quite likely that, there could be 40, 50 application sites. So obviously we're not traveling to each one of those maybe 6 months after something's applied, but we're evaluating that nutrient management plan, making sure the soil test data information is there, making sure the applications were correct, making sure the records are shown on there that they applied, during the right period, when rain's not predicted, sort of those sort of things. So those inspections do occur twice a year, and those inspections are occurring at the headquarters, but not necessarily at the application sites.
Great. And I just wanted to mention that the project team has requested that we let folks know as they're reviewing the questions, it's becoming apparent that many of the questions coming in really pertain to the next step in the TMDL development process, the preliminary modeling results. So as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, there may be questions that Ohio EPA can't answer right now because they do kind of look forward to the next step in the process. But as Paul had mentioned, mentioned, these are things that will be addressed in upcoming webinars and upcoming outreach, as well as the development of the frequently asked questions document. So they just wanted to acknowledge that they are reading those questions and definitely, are following them, and they will be addressed in the future. Okay, so the next question, is Ohio EPA able to make an estimate of the contribution of stream bank erosion to the loads? Is there a standard model for this? I don't know, Josh, if you're there, or if Paul, you want to jump in.
Yeah, I can jump in. There is not a standard model, but what hopefully you've heard us mention a few times today is we intend to have a really detailed source assessment of all of the sources of phosphorus and dissolved phosphorus throughout the watershed. And I did mention earlier that does include stream bank erosion. And in fact, we talk about it in what we've added to the lab. This science is it's constantly being updated. It's really an evolving science of everything we're talking about. We intend to bring in as much of that as possible to show where the sources are coming from, to help us guide how to deal with these various sources. So we don't anticipate saying this is the exact percentage of stream bank erosion that's of phosphorus that's from stream bank erosion, because we don't think that the science is there. It would be just full of uncertainty and error. But we will present the best information we have, and that's in the idea to guide us to the best implementation practices.
I would add to that with the emphasis on developing local implementation plans, there's no and the way that we're evaluating the load allocation, there's no reason why, if areas where extensive bank erosion are known to be substantial contributors to stream phosphorus, that they aren't part of a non-point source implementation strategy or 9-element plan. So that's one of the biggest values we see in developing the TMDL the way we have, because as you move down to that local scale and you're working with local cooperators, we may have better information.
Josh, if somebody is interested in getting involved with one of the work groups, like the point source work group, do we have a way for their interest to be known? Should they email you? Should they email the TMDL email address?
Either would work, either the general TMDL address or emailing me directly, and we'll work on getting a list of people who are interested together and start looking for availability soon.
And that email address is available on the website, I'm assuming?
Hi, Kelly. They can send it to EPA TMDL at epa.ohio.gov.
Great, thank you. And we can put that in the chat as well. If you're a point source and you're interested in letting Ohio EPA know that you'd like to join the work group, that will be an email address you can use. Okay, we have probably some time for a few more questions, so give us just a moment.
Kelly, this is Kirk Hines from ODA. I was going to try to answer the one question about CAFOs and total phosphorus loading.
Wonderful, thanks. Can you be sure to just read it out to everyone too, please?
I sure will. So the
Thank
question is regarding, it says, has the total phosphorus loading from CAFOs been quantified? And if not, what data gaps exist? So let me say, I think from a loading perspective, that's something that, I'm sure the mass balance and other things will continue to evaluate. But the one thing that we have done is to try to look at really how many operations and what the animal numbers are in the Western Lake Erie Basin, in the Maumee, and try to compare that to what the phosphorus is removed from corn, soybeans, really from the cropland. So we've looked at those numbers, so we can, we've certainly looked at how much manure is produced by the livestock in the basin, and again compared that and think that that's approximately 20% of what is removed annually from the crop needs out there in the cropland areas. So we'll continue to evaluate that and really just to say that, probably the additional needs, the other 80% would have to come from another nutrient source. And most of us know that that would be from fertilizer and others. So we've certainly looked at that sort of mass balance and make sure that's there. So as long as we're replacing, when we apply the manure, that's replacing the fertilizer, we should be in an okay situation. But we continue to look at that as we move forward.
Thanks, Kirk. All right, hold tight. We'll have a couple more questions and answers provided. Once we said ask questions, the floodgates opened, so folks are just taking a minute to kind of read through them. One thing to mention to folks as the team is looking through questions, if you haven't already subscribed to the listserv, it's a great way to get updates for future webinars, for future in-person meetings. That information was provided in your confirmation email for this webinar. It's also available on Ohio EPA's website, the links that have been provided. So feel free to subscribe and make sure that you are in the loop as to TMDL process update. Okay, we have another question. Let's see. Scrolling down. Oh, I think, Melinda, I think this is one we've gotten already. I may not have cleared this out of the deck about stream bank erosion to loads. I believe this one has been asked and answered. We appreciate everyone's patience. Some of these are definitely more than yes, no answers. Okay, we have another one. Most of the BMPs for non-point source are voluntary. However, load reductions for point sources are not. Those are incorporated in permits or ORC. How will non-point source BMPs or application limits, such as for commercial fertilizer or manure, be incorporated into required reductions rather than voluntary? I don't know if Paul, you want to take this one? Kirk probably wants to jump in.
I can certainly start it. The nature of the Clean Water Act, our attorney's not here, but agriculture stormwater is exempt from regulation based on the Clean Water Act. And therefore, TMDLs basically rely on voluntary incentive-based measures for most non-point sources, whereas we have a regulatory arm for the point sources. So I think that pretty directly answers the question, but Kirk, please, whatever you can add to this, we would appreciate your insight.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think there are a few things that we'll continue to do. And as I talked about earlier, so much of it is not just necessarily the rate of the nutrient applications and how it's applied, but really just the management piece of that. So, and really they're just talking about the timing of it. Can we change sources? So, fortunately for us, there is some things that we already regulate and continue to tweak with rules. So we certainly have education requirements with fertilizer applicators. That's something that's recently been enacted. We already talked a little bit about our CAFOs and what we're doing there. But, I think some of the things that we've talked to, through the administration and others about continuing to monitor is just looking at sort of what are those fertilized cells and what's, what direction are we headed there? We'll continue to monitor the amount of livestock facilities and how much manure is produced. And, I can just share that we have seen just in the last several years, a reduction in the amount of fertilizer that's been applied. So, earlier I talked about sort of the maintenance level of nutrients and the amount of nutrients that are removed with each crop. And we're seeing those numbers of the fertilizer or the nutrients that's applied back actually being reduced. So, I think we'll continue. I know we'll continue to monitor those and guide those. And again, I think we can guide how that works through the education requirements, through our permit requirements for livestock facilities. So I think we'll continue to work hard on that.
All right, we have another question about 9-element plans. Are there any examples where TMDLs have been done that rely on 9-element plans for implementation?
Can you guys hear us right now?
Yes.
Okay, Melinda's going to take this.
Hi. So 9-element plans are a relatively new tool that we've had to address non-point source pollution in the state. And they are required for projects that receive federal funding through our Section 319 program or the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grant program. So they're an important tool to bring in grant money into the watershed to address pollution and to fund projects. So we have started writing our TMDLs at the smaller near field scale to set themselves up to allow the development of a 9-element plan more easily. We are working on this right now with the Black River watershed. And it is a way that we are going to be writing near field TMDLs in the future because the 9-element plans are an important mechanism for bringing funding into the watershed that otherwise would not be available. And they also look at, projects at a local level. They involve local stakeholders and local interests and really, try to get everyone involved in addressing the water quality issues within that small watershed. So it is relatively new, but it is something that we are definitely going to be doing moving forward.
Okay, hold on, folks. They're scanning additional questions. Okay, here's another question about TMDL modeling. Paul or Melinda, I'm not sure if Josh is still with us, whoever wants to take this one. You need to describe how the TMDL modeling information may potentially be used to address management decisions because that affects what modeling efforts should be made. So I don't know, Paul.
Yeah, I can take this.
Okay.
We think that the modeling is showing us what the sources are of nutrients, and in general, we presented in the past the general mass balance modeling, where in this system we know that non-point sources are the predominant source of nutrients being delivered to Western Lake Erie. So right there, the modeling has geared our management decisions. We really need to get a lot of non-point source reductions. So in theory, not in theory, in practice, the modeling that we're doing, we're expecting it to, stakeholders take that. Here's where we're seeing the hot sources. Here's where we're seeing the most material being produced. And we're going to work with these stakeholder groups and come up with recommendations, policy recommendations, reduction recommendations, and then that will get taken through Ohio Department of Agriculture, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and Ohio EPA worked up through the management levels, the director levels of these agencies, and that'll be what we end up including in TMDL. So I think that describes it.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, we have a question about Ohio EPA following federal TMDL development guidance. Will Ohio EPA be following federal TMDL development guidance?
Yeah, and the answer to that is yes. We're required to follow federal TMDL guidance. We're required to follow Ohio's specific TMDL requirements. We've been in very regular contact with the US EPA region that oversees Ohio throughout every step of this. And they were involved in our listening sessions in November, and I believe some of them are listening in today. Right, and I'll add to that, they are required to approve our TMDL, the US EPA. They have a certain amount of time once we submit it that they must make an action to either approve or deny the TMDL.
Thanks, Paul. So the team would like to know if there are any specific questions related to, the steps that have already been undertaken, things that, the loading analysis plan or outreach. Feel free to ask those types of questions. Again, many of the questions that have come in are sort of these future-looking questions that can't necessarily be answered right now, but will be addressed in future webinar updates as the TMDL development process progresses. So if you have any questions about some of the existing documents or things that Paul and Melinda touched on in the presentation regarding changes to the loading analysis plan, or topics maybe brought up at the listening sessions or planned public outreach events, or even questions about types of outreach you would like to see moving forward, feel free to put those into the chat. So I'm not seeing any new questions coming in. So Paul, Melinda, Josh, if you're interested in closing remarks, I think we'd be ready for that.
Sure. Well, we can have a quick look at this, the last slide. Just thank everyone for participating today. We do look forward to seeing folks in January 20th or seeing you virtually. Those meetings are open to anyone who's interested in joining us. And I believe we're going to share the email. We're welcome to field comments. We've made it clear that we'll have we're willing to interact with anyone in between these outreach issues. And then there will be various small stakeholder groups getting together. Josh is organizing those, and we intend to start those in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.